Hey guys, in this section, we're going to be learning about the Bootstrap framework. And this is one of many external CSS layout systems. But this is probably one of the most popular and the one that you're most likely to come across out in the wild. Bootstrap, as I said, is a CSS framework created in 2010 by two Twitter developers, Mark Otto and Jacob Thornton. Now, the power of Bootstrap and the reason why it became so popular is it contained pre-made CSS files, which you can simply include into your project in order to use their pre-built components and styling. For example, if you wanted to have some tags in your website, you could create a look like this by simply adding a few classes to your HTML. On top of that, one of the biggest reasons why Bootstrap took off is because of their 12-column layout system built on top of Flexbox that makes it really easy to create responsive websites and websites that simply just work and look great on mobile as well as desktop. The so-called mobile-first approach. So how exactly does it work? Well, let's say you had a button which just said home. You can see that the standard button rendered from HTML doesn't look fantastic. But if we included just 5 classes which come from the Bootstrap CSS, so we include the pre-built CSS into our project and we add the styling and the components by adding these classes to our HTML, then all of a sudden what you'll end up with is something that looks beautiful and pre-styled like this. And because we don't have to worry about writing all of the CSS code, all we need to know is which classes we need to add to our HTML. Then it makes everything so much easier and so much quicker when we want to build components into our website. Now, as I mentioned, Bootstrap is a type of CSS framework. What exactly are these? Well, they're pre-made CSS files which you can include into your projects. If we had a look at the Bootstrap GitHub, and because Bootstrap is completely open source, then all of the code is visible. And you can see it's got styling defined for all of the different components. For example, this is inside the card component, and it's got classes that define what a card body should look like, what kind of layout it should have, what kind of color it should have, as well as what the card title should look like, subtitle, and it's got all of this predefined CSS, which we can simply insert straight into our HTML. Now, the two most popular external CSS frameworks are Bootstrap and Foundation, but there are lots more like MUI and Tailwind and a whole bunch more. And the reason why they're so great is because they allow us to add in pre-built components and develop websites quickly and efficiently. If we look at the usage percentages across the internet, you can see that the biggest CSS external framework is still Bootstrap, with close to 80% of the market share. But just because we learn about Bootstrap, it doesn't mean that everything we learned about CSS is null and void. In fact, if you look at the top here, when we look at the absolute usage percentages of all of the different frameworks across the internet, you can see the largest percentage are still websites that don't use any external CSS frameworks. What does it mean when there are no CSS frameworks being used? Well, it means you're probably using native CSS like Flexbox and Grid and Float and all of the great things that we learned before. So Bootstrap doesn't replace any of that knowledge. And in fact, we should be in a situation where we don't actually need to depend on any sort of external framework. But they are really useful when we want to develop websites quickly and easily, and we don't want to spend a ton of time designing our websites, because it comes with all of the pre-made styling and all of the styling rules that we can easily conform to by using their components. So what are the pros of external CSS frameworks? Well, they're easy and they're fast to use, and you get a ton of pre-built components like this pricing plan, which took us ages to build ourselves. And you also get really consistent styling across your website. It's almost like you hired a professional developer who kept everything looking on brand. And finally, you have really good browser compatibility because they've tested all of the different browsers, Safari, Chrome, Brave, and whichever browsers that your user might be using, so you don't actually have to do all of this complicated testing. You can just trust that it works out of the box. Now, what are some of the downsides of CSS frameworks? Well, one of the biggest downsides is something called class bloat. Remember previously we mentioned that it's a really good idea to separate structure from style, where we said that HTML is for structure, so adding in elements that describe what the purpose is, and CSS is for style. Using external CSS frameworks, because we're adding everything into the classes, then very quickly you end up with what's called class bloat, where you have a lot of styling going into the actual HTML file. And it looks a lot less clean than if we had just used something like Grid or Flexbox, where we have all of our predefined classes and we go easy on the classes that we add into our HTML file. The other downside is customization. If you want to build a website where you want to have full control over every pixel and layout and everything to be exactly the way you designed it, then external CSS frameworks is probably not the way to go. Because in order to customize each and every component, it can be really time consuming. So when should you use these CSS frameworks like Bootstrap and when should you not? Well, when you are building a mobile-first, responsive website that you want to put online very quickly and access beautiful components designed by professional designers, keeping everything on your website looking slick and uniform, then you probably want to consider using Bootstrap. But if you're building a very simple website where you just need HTML and CSS and you can quickly throw it up, or if you're building a really complex custom design website and you want complete control over the design, then it's probably not a good idea to use an external CSS framework like Bootstrap. So we've spoken so much about the pros and cons, when to use, when not to use, but how do you actually use it? Well, one of the easiest ways is to include it via a CDN link. We've seen how we can use the link tag in order to add our style sheets. And in a similar way, we can use these link tags that simply gets hold of the style sheet from an external resource. So in this case, it's through a CDN, which stands for Content Delivery Network. And what these are is little hubs all across the entire world, and it knows where your users are located. So when they load up your website and try to access this particular CSS file that contains all of the Bootstrap code, then it can find the closest location with the shortest distance to the server that has that content. And that just means that even though this has to be downloaded from somewhere, it can be delivered to your user and rendered very, very quickly. And from our point of view as developers, all we need to do is simply include this link into the head section of our HTML. And if we want any of the functionality like drop-down menus or clickable buttons, then we want to include the Bootstrap script just before the end of the body section. So somewhere right about here. Now let's go ahead and try an exercise and see if we can upgrade our website quickly by using Bootstrap. Download 11.0 Bootstrap Intro, and if you open it inside of VS Code, open the index.html, you can see there are 4 to-dos for you to complete. And once you've completed all of these 4 steps, you should end up with a card that displays a sunflower image. And this is one of the pre-built Bootstrap components. Now, how are you going to do this? Well, firstly, you can head over to getbootstrap.com, which is the main Bootstrap website. And then I want you to include the Bootstrap files using CDN. You only need the CSS file through this link element for now. And then I want you to go into the documentation if you want to look up anything regarding the card component, which is all the way down here in components under the card section. Now, you know what the goal should look like. You've got all of the resources to get started, and you should be able to work through each of the to-dos one by one. pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, hopefully you've given that a go and you've seen that the Bootstrap card has some example code which you can straight up just drop into your file. If you haven't given this a go, pause the video now, don't continue, because things will get harder and harder as we go on in the course. And if you just watch the videos, eventually at some point, things are not going to make sense because you haven't had the practice. Make things easy for your future self by putting in lots of effort and practice now. All right, enough said. First thing, let's walk through the solution together, and hopefully you can check it against your work. Now, the first thing we're going to do is add the Bootstrap link, which comes from the home page, and we just want this first link that is going to include the style sheet. And you can see this is a link with a relationship of style sheet. So instead of using our own style sheet, we're now using the Bootstrap CSS. And if you're wondering what that min stands for, it's basically a file where all of the spaces are taken away so that it's as short as possible. So it loads up quicker because there's no spaces and everything's all jumbled, which is impossible for humans to read, but it works just fine for the computer. To do number 2 is to add the Bootstrap pre-built card. So if we go into our docs and find our card component, you can see the first example is pretty much the card we want to build. If we look at the goal, we've got our card title, some example text, a button, and an image. And this is exactly the same as this example. So let's copy the HTML and paste it into here under to do number 2. Now let's check our work. Let's show it in preview and see what it looks like. It looks pretty good other than the fact that the image is pretty much completely broken. So step 3 is to change the image source to display the flower JPEG image. The image is right here. And right now the source is completely empty because it's an example. Let's go ahead and change it to our image, which is flower.jpg. You see it show up immediately. And as always with images, let's add a alt text so that people with screen readers know what it's all about. All right, now the final step is a little bit of a revision step because I wanted you to use Flexbox to center the card in the vertical and horizontal center. If we take a look at this URL on our browser, you can see it's stuck all the way to the top left, which is default HTML layout. But if we want it right here in the middle, then we're going to need to use some Flexbox magic. And we're going to do that inside an internal style element right here under to do number 4. What do we need to target? Well, we need to target the entire card, and the topmost level is this Flex container. The reason why it's of class Flex container is because this comes from the Bootstrap CSS, and it's got some styling in there that defines that container, but we can always override it. And this is really, really important. When we want to override a particular Bootstrap style, we have to make sure that it's more specific. So either it goes inside an internal style element, or it goes inside an inline style property, or if we're using our standard external CSS and we use a link linking to, I don't know, say /CSS/style.css, and we have a style.css file somewhere in our project, then you got to make sure that your custom CSS file occurs below the Bootstrap link. That way, this is first looked at, and then the browser looks at your custom style sheet, and you can override any of the classes that come from Bootstrap. So this is an important point to remember for the future when you're creating your own custom style sheets. All right, so now in order to override the style here, now we might be building on top of existing Bootstrap styles, or we might be specifying something they don't even care about and it's not defined in the Bootstrap CSS at all. In our case, we want to change this Flex container to display Flex because we know that this is one of the simplest ways to center anything in CSS. And the first thing we need to change is the justify content, set to center, And the second one is align items set to center. And finally, we need to make sure that the entire container takes up the full height and not just some proportion of the height that's enough for the content. So let's set the height to 100 viewport height. And now you can see our card is perfectly centered in the middle using Flexbox. It's a component that we've borrowed and customized from Bootstrap, and you can see how easy it was and quick to create this layout by leveraging the power of Bootstrap. In the next lesson, we're going to dive deeper into Bootstrap, and we're going to look at how the Bootstrap 12-column layout system actually works in practice. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. All right, so now that we've had a little bit of a taste of what Bootstrap can do, let's dive deep into one of the most powerful features of Bootstrap, which is the 12-column layout system. The 12-column system is made of 3 components. Firstly, we need a div that has a class of container, and this is going to be the starting point. Next, inside that container, we need another div, which is going to be of class row. And inside the row is where we will have our items, and they will be laid out using the column system. So what does this look like in code? Well, it's pretty simple. We have a container that contains a single row. And then within the row, we can have as many items as we like, and they're laid out using the column class. Pretty simple so far, and you're probably thinking, well, there's nothing very groundbreaking here. Now, the interesting thing starts happening when you have multiple columns laid out inside these rows, because automatically Bootstrap will try to give every column inside the row equal spacing and space them across the entire width of the container. So if you had a container which included a row that had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 divs in there, each with the class set as col, short for column, then it will divide up the entire width by 6. And if you had 3 of them, then it would give each of them a third of the space. Now, the Bootstrap container is responsive. So by defining a div with the class of container, you're actually telling it to have a different size on different sized screens. If we had an XL or an XXL screen, so like a desktop or a TV or something, then that container is going to be this size. And you can see that there's several breakpoints that are responsive to the different device screen sizes. On mobile, maybe the container would be 540 pixels. On an iPad, maybe it would be 720 or 960 pixels. And on desktop, maybe it would be about 1000 pixels. You can use the dash plus these different letters to specify at which point you want your container to be 100%. Container SM is the same as the normal container, but container MD or medium means that on small screens, the container would already reach 100% of the width of the screen. And again, remember, all of these sizes here are referring to the width of the viewport, so only this dimension. And then as we go down the line, we're starting to specify 100% width on larger and larger screens until we reach this container fluid, which basically says that on all screen sizes, we want it to reach from edge to edge, which is 100% width. In most cases, you will see these two being used quite frequently because the container gives a nice sort of margin around the left and the right, and the container fluid is when you want that edge-to-edge behavior. The layout system gets more interesting when we start using sized columns. Instead of just writing col as the class, we can actually set the class as, for example, col-2 or col-4. And what this is saying is, if we think of each of our rows as having 12 columns, and we split them all up into the 12 equal size columns, like this. So if you count, this is actually a total of 12. Then when we create a div, we can specify, well, how many of these columns do we want to occupy? In this case, this div wants 2 of those columns, and then this one wants 4 of them, and then the final one wants 6. Based on the classes that you choose, Bootstrap will know how much space to allocate each div on a percentage basis. So you could view the col6 as a 50% and the col2 as 1/6 of the entire width, and so on and so forth. So you can use all of the numbers col1 all the way up to col12, and you can split up the proportion of your screen and the content inside. So maybe you would have a navigation section on the left that you only want to take up 2 out of 12 width, and then the main content here maybe could take up 10 out of 12 of the width, and so on and so forth. And this is a really, really easy and intuitive way of sizing your content using Bootstrap. And this is what the code would look like. So we have 3 divs, and we're giving this one 2 out of 12, 4 out of 12, 6 out of 12, and this is the layout that we end up with. And we didn't have to write any CSS. All we had to do was add in the pre-built layout classes. Again, it's really important to know that Bootstrap has predefined breakpoints, and these dimensions are defined based on common screen sizes. And even though these numbers are constantly changing, generally I would say that small is for mobile devices, medium is for tablets and iPads, large is for laptop, extra large is for desktop, and extra large is for anything crazy, like maybe a TV or something. And extra small is for devices that are maybe longer than they are wide. So maybe foldable phones and even really narrow phone screens. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to is the directionality of the signs here. All of these breakpoints, which we'll often use, for example, col-sm-2, this section refers to the screens which are greater than this dimension. So that means the small breakpoint is between here and here and covers the range between 576 and 768, and each of them always go up. So this is an important point to keep in mind when you're dealing with the Bootstrap breakpoints. Now, one of the great things about Bootstrap breakpoints is we don't really need the media queries as much, because this covers pretty much a lot of the different device dimensions, and we don't have to manually write all the pixel sizes and add media queries into our CSS. We can target the different sizes and make our website responsive by using the pre-built breakpoints. Here's an example of the Bootstrap breakpoints. Here we're saying that on a small screen and above, we want the dimension ratio to be 2, 4, and 6. So this means that on desktop, on laptop, on TV, it's all going to have this size, and even on mobile as well. But below the size of mobile, it is not defined as having these proportions. So it will default to giving each of these divs 100%. And similarly, if you don't add a number here, so we could, for example, here it's 12 columns, 12 divided by 3, so these are actually col-sm4s. But if we don't define a number, you remember that they will automatically distribute. But what would it look like if we reduce the screen size to less than a mobile size? Well, all of these divs will go to 100% width. When the overall width is less than 576, then all of these items default to as if they just had column defined, so col as the class. And the col class by default is going to take up 100% of the width in the small size screen. Now, in a single div, you can actually also have multiple breakpoints. So in this case, what it's saying is on the large devices and above, then it should take up 4 out of 12 of the width. On medium sizes and above, well, because the above is already defined, so then this case is only on medium devices, then it should take up 8 out of 12 of the width. And on small devices, it should take up 12 out of 12, so full width. Here we're simulating a large screen, so maybe on a laptop or a desktop, then it's taking up 4 out of 12. It's this kind of proportion. And then we go over to the next size down, say on an iPad, then it's going to take up 8 out of 12 of the screen. And just for example's sakes, let's go down even further to a mobile size where we want it to take up 100% or full width of the screen. Because as you imagine, when we have more screen real estate, it's easier to see things. And when we're working on smaller screens, we want to make things generally a bit larger so that it's easier for users to see our content. In addition to having multiple breakpoints in each div, you can also mix and match the types of definition. So for example, here we've got 2 sized columns, col2 and col4. So it's always going to take up 2 out of 12 this section, 4 out of 12 here. But this last one, notice how we've just left it as the column class. Now this means that it's going to automatically adjust in size in order to take up whatever proportion remains. Bootstrap layout is a little bit complicated when you're first working with it, and it's really important that you read the docs and also have plenty of practice before things start to make more sense. So in order for you to practice, I've created a website at appbury.github.io/bootstrap-layout. And if you go to this website, you'll see that I've got 3 exercises in total for you. The idea of the exercises is that at the top, there will be a demo area, which is the effect that you're trying to achieve. For example, in this case, we want these divs to be 50% on desktop and 100% on mobile. So as I reduce the width, you'll see that it gets to a point where we reach that SM breakpoint where it goes into 100% width. As you scroll down, each of the different exercises will have different proportions, and what you want to do is to modify the HTML code inside here, which is responsible for the styling of the area that you control, which are the divs underneath the examples. And I want you to add the classes for using the 12-column layout system so that your area behaves exactly the same as the top area when you reduce the size and hit the various different breakpoints. If you get stuck, be sure to check out the layout section of the Bootstrap documentation. And here you'll see the different Bootstrap breakpoints. Also, you can read up more on how the columns work, how the containers work, and how the grid system works. Pause the video now and give this challenge a go. So hopefully you've given this a go and you managed to get everything to work correctly. Let's go through the solution together. The first example says it should be 50% on desktop and 100% on mobile. We know that the desktop breakpoint is the XL, so we can define column-XL-6, and 6 out of 12 is of course 50%. Now, in order to get it to be 100% on mobile, we could say column-SM-12, which is 100%. And we can add that to both divs. Now, if I go ahead and set apply changes, you can see now when I reduce the width of the window that it's going to hit that breakpoint where below which it's no longer going to be 50% and it's going to start taking up the full width. Now, you might remember from previously, we said that the Bootstrap breakpoints target sizes this particular size and above. So when we define column XL6, we're saying anything that's above the XL breakpoint, which is greater than 1200 pixels, should be 50%. You might have realized that you don't actually need to define this because everything else is going to default to 100%. So if I apply changes again, you can see that my purple example still behaves the same as the green example, and I've only changed the behavior of the XL size and above and changed its layout. All right, so let's go to exercise number 2. And in this case, I haven't given you exactly what they should do or how they should behave. And instead, I wanted you to simply just reduce the width of the screen to see how it changes through the different sizes. The first one's easy. Pretty much all of the larger sizes, all the way down to the large breakpoint, takes up the full 12 width column. And you can take out a ruler if you want to measure the screen, but we can see that column 1 is roughly half of the width of the row. Column 2 and 3 are pretty much equal size, so it's probably going to be 6, 3, and 3. Let's modify this so that we target the large breakpoint first. So we'll say col-lg-6 for the first column. The second column is going to be col-lg-3, and the same for the third column. So now if I click apply changes, you can see it's now taking up the same proportions. But when we hit this breakpoint that's below the large breakpoint, our columns by default go to 100%, whereas the example actually does something different. The top column takes up 100% and the other two take up half of the width. And you can see that behavior continues all the way until the very small size. So that means that we've got an SM breakpoint there defined. Now, once you work with this for a long time, you can spot each of the breakpoints pretty much by eye. But initially, you can always just switch around, try different ones, try the SM, try the XL, and see which ones actually behave like the example. There's nothing wrong with trial and error. When it hits the smaller screen size, our column 1 is going to take up the full width of the row. And then the other two on the smaller breakpoint are going to take up half of the width, so col SM6. And similarly, the third one does the same thing. So let's apply the change, and you can see now at this breakpoint, they also behave exactly the same. So now all we have left is the final one, which is just the smallest breakpoint for the columns. And here, what's actually happening is each of these columns are taking up 10 out of 12 of the columns. Now I can spot that by eye, but also I created this exercise so I know. But if you try some different numbers, you'll probably get there as well. So if we define the smallest size as column, let's just try an 8 to start with, so I can show you this trial and error process. And we know that all the columns behave the same at that breakpoint. If we click apply changes and we go here, we can see, well, 8 is clearly too small. So let's go up a size and let's change to 10 out of 12. And once I hit apply changes, you can see we now have both sets of columns behaving exactly the same at all the different breakpoints. This one was a little bit harder, admittedly, and it required a little bit more thinking and probably trial and error on your part, but hopefully by the end of it, you would understand a bit better about how these different breakpoints work and at which points they hit. So now for the final exercise, and this one we've got two columns. Initially they start out in one line, taking up a particular proportion, and then we hit a certain breakpoint and it changes the proportion. Column 1 gets a little bit wider, takes up more space compared to column 2. And then if we reduce a little bit more, that changes again at the next breakpoint, and then again, and then finally taking up full width. So let's start with the largest breakpoint we know, which is the XXL. Let's say that col-XXL, and let's define it as 1 out of 12, and then give the other half, 12 minus 1 is 11. And now let's apply the change, and you can see that is the correct proportion. Again, this might require trial and error on your part. Don't be too hard on yourself if you didn't manage to get it first time. I wouldn't be able to either if it was somebody else's exercise like this. Now let's hit the next breakpoint just about here, and this is going to be the next breakpoint down. This is the XL. We've just hit 1200. And a tip for working with responsiveness, when you're wondering, how do I know that it's the 1200 pixel breakpoint that got hit? If you go into the Chrome Developer Tools and click on this button to toggle the device toolbar and change the dimensions to responsive, then you can click this drag bar and look at the top here. This is the important width that we need to look at. Once I expand it to 1200, you can see that jump in size happen just around there. So we know that the 1200 breakpoint is the XL breakpoint, and you can work this out this way as well. So just a tip for the future when you're working with any kind of responsiveness, this is really useful to know. But most of the time I would judge responsiveness just by eye when you're designing the layout to see what looks good. All right, so let's hit the next breakpoint at the XL size, 1200 pixels. So this is col-XL, and I reckon this is a ratio of 2 to 10. So let's do col-XL2, col-XL10. Let's apply our changes, and that's pretty good. So now let's keep reducing until we hit the next breakpoint, and this is going to be the next level down, which is large LG. And I reckon this is probably 4 to 8. So col-LG-4, and the next one will be col-LG-8. And notice that each of these always add up to 12 because you can see in the example layout they're only taking up one row. If it didn't add up to 12, then it will go to the next row in order to take up the amount of space that we specified. Now we have the next breakpoint, which is the col-MD, and this one's easy to spot because it's half-half, so it's going to be 6. And finally, we have the rest are by default going to take up 100%. So you could define the SM, but that's also the default behavior, so you could also leave it out. There you have it. That's the final solution code for exercise 3 and exercise 2 and exercise 1. Hopefully you managed to get there in the end, even if there was a little bit of trial and error and some difficulty. But once you've used Bootstrap Layout a few times, you'll get used to this idea. And it's a really intuitive way to lay out our screen, and it's really easy to manipulate and to create different layout designs. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to be talking through the different Bootstrap components. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. Hey guys, in this lesson, we're going to be learning about one of the most powerful features of Bootstrap and one of the biggest reasons why we would be using Bootstrap in our project in the first place. And that is the concept of the Bootstrap components. The pre-built, pre-styled components like buttons and cards and carousels and a whole load of beautiful things that we get access to simply by adding in a Bootstrap class into our HTML. Let's start with one of the most commonly used components, which is the Bootstrap button. And this is a really good place to start because you also see the default Bootstrap styling and the color scheme. In most of the components that you'll get access to through Bootstrap, if you want to give it a particular color, it's really easy to access all of these default colors by simply using their name. In most cases in a Bootstrap design website, the primary button, the go to, the buy or the contact us or download, whatever, will be this blue color, and you can access all of the other colors through each of their Bootstrap names. And they give you a little bit of a hint as to what they're used for. So success is usually like an OK button, danger, maybe if you click this button something really bad happens, or warning, etc. And you get access to this button and this button styling simply by creating a button HTML element, giving it the class btn for a Bootstrap button, and then adding the class for the color scheme from this list that you want to choose. Let's try this out. Go ahead and download the starting files from the 11.2 Bootstrap components zip file. And once you've extracted and opened it inside VS Code, head over to index.html. Now here you'll notice that I've already added in the Bootstrap link. We've got a style section which we can add custom CSS to, and in the body area, I want you to use the Bootstrap documentation. So if you go to the Bootstrap main website at getbootstrap.com, go to docs, and then scroll down to the components, find the buttons, and I want you to put in a green button that says OK somewhere onto this website. Remember, you can preview it in real time to see if it's working, and pause the video now and complete this challenge. All right, so this is pretty simple. We have a button, which we said is going to say OK. And in order to style it using Bootstrap, the first thing we do is add the BTN class, and you can see automatically the font changes, the background color changes. And then we said we wanted to have a green button. So the green button is BTN-success. So let's go ahead and add BTN-success. And once we're done, you can see we've got a beautiful green button with a hover animation, with nice styling, a good size, rounded corners, all of that goodness without doing a lot of work at all. It was super, super simple to create this. And this should give you a taste of what's yet to come. The next component I want to talk about is a really useful one, which is the card, which you already saw in the previous lessons exercise. And as always, all we need to do is go to that particular components page, and then we can simply copy the code, paste it into our website, and replace certain parts of the code, such as the image source or the alt text. Now, one component that you're probably going to be using whenever you're building a website is a navbar. And the Bootstrap navbars are some of the best designed navbars I've seen. And it also is super easy to include simply using their example snippet codes. If you head over to the navbar, you can read on how it works and also what some of the examples they have are. For example, this one with a search bar with some drop downs, and this one which describes how you can have the brand at the top left, or if you want an image and text brand. And you can scroll through this to find the kind of navbar you want to create and to use the example code. Now, another area for the navbars is if you head over to examples and you go to the header section, you can see some even more fancily laid out navbars over here. In order to show you some of the different types of components and how they can be used in real life, we are going to be building a moving startups website. They're called Move It, which is pretty simple. And it's got a one-page website with many different sections. And I'm going to show you just how easy it is to build this entire fully fledged website using just Bootstrap components. So the first thing we need is that navbar. And you'll notice that I've taken the navbar that is pretty much this standard one. So it's got a field which you can search for, say, the postcode, if our company works in your area. It's got some drop-down menus. It's got some other little areas which you can click on. So let's go ahead and copy the code for the starting point of our navbar. And let's paste it into the body of our code. So you can see as soon as I've done that, I've got my navbar show up. But one thing you'll notice as soon as you start playing around with it is when a Bootstrap navbar is in a smaller width, it will automatically show a hamburger menu, and that menu should have a drop down with all of the buttons from the navigation bar. Now, why is our button not working? Now, remember previously I said when we get started with Bootstrap, there's two links to include via CDN. The first one is the style sheet, and that gives us all of the styling. But the second one is the scripting code that gives us all of the functionality, because this gives us access to the Bootstrap JavaScript code. Now, we don't need to understand anything about JavaScript just yet in order to use it. All we need to do is copy that link and go to right at the end, just before the closing body tag, and paste that script link in there. And you can see as soon as I've done that, my buttons now work, my drop downs work, and all of these clicking functionality bits start working. And this again comes straight out of the box from Bootstrap. Let's take a look at this website in a larger format by opening inside Chrome. You can see that for the most part, these two navbars look pretty similar. All I did is got rid of some of the components and changed some of the other things. For example, this button is disabled so that users can't click on it. And in our version, we actually just got rid of it. We can do that quite easily by finding that button, and you can see the reason why it's not enabled is because it has this class of disabled. So if we get rid of that, then you can see this button is now active once more. But we don't actually want it at all, so let's delete that entire list item. And now we only have 3 links: home, link, and drop down. So let's rename those links to about and services. And again, because this is just a simple anchor tag, you know exactly how to work with this. So the first one is link. So we'll change this to about. And the drop down, instead of reading drop down, we'll say is called services. And you can imagine in the future, we would have our different services in the drop down, like moving with a van, moving by hauling everything yourself, or something else. But this is just an example of how our navbar could look. Now, the first part of the navbar is the navbar brand, and we can see that right up here. We've got an anchor tag, which is called the navbar brand. For example, if I change it to move it, then that's going to change our brand text. In addition, we can also have an image in here. So you can simply just add an image, give it a source. Maybe let's use one of the images we already have in our folder. For example, the dog.jpg. Now, because this image is super large and we haven't really resized it, then it's not really going to work in the navbar, but you can always change this. So let's change the height to just 20 pixels. Then you can see our navbar brand image show up right there. Now, in our case, we're not going to use an image. Instead, I'm going to delete that tag and I'm going to use an SVG. This is a good time to show you the SVGs which are available through Bootstrap. So if you go back to the home page and you click on icons, you can see you got all of these free icons for you to use in any of your websites, paid, monetized, whatever. And it's really hard actually sometimes finding well-designed icons that you can simply add to your project without having to pay royalties and buy it from a designer. So this is also really neat. And you can search through the different icons by using the filter. So the one that I found is actually this box with seams on it, which looks very much like a moving company box to me. And you can either simply just copy the SVG straight up into your HTML. So if I paste it in here, you'll see it show up right there. Alternatively, you can also include it as an image and you set the source to the SVG that you have saved in your folder, which is right here. I'm going to use the image in the folder by setting it as a source, and I'm going to set the alt text to move it brand icon. And then I'm going to change the height to, let's say 30, so that it's a little bit bigger. And we now have a navbar that looks the same as the example. Now, on the right-hand side, there is a form here, and I know we haven't spoken much about forms. That's all yet to come when we learn more about how to have the actual form functionality later on, especially in the backend section. This is all going to come in really handy. But for now, we're just going to change this search bar from search to say postcode and check. So that's pretty easy to find. You can either use Command F to find those words, or you can scroll through your code to find it as well. Let's change the button to say check. And let's change the placeholder for that search bar into, say, postcode. There we go. And now we've completed our navbar. And if you had to design all of that from scratch and all of the CSS that's included, and you can see just how much CSS there is actually. If you click on one of these items, you can see the nav link that I just clicked on has all the padding defined, has all of this defined, has toggle styling, and that's just one part of this entire navbar. So you can see just how much time we're saving ourselves, and we're able to leverage a professional design and create something that looks really contemporary and beautiful. Now let's move on to the next section. And this entire section is made up of different components. So maybe an H1, a heading, a paragraph, 2 buttons, and an image. But if we want to just take this layout, I actually got it from the examples. The examples area is really, really good for taking bits and bobs of the different code snippets, different components that they've already styled and created for you, and simply putting it into your website where it makes sense. So this is a hero, and as you can see, it's this one. It's pretty much exactly the same: title, text, 2 buttons, and an image. And everything is styled beautifully already for you. In order to use it, all we need to do is right click on inspect. And now we want to expand our elements area. And what I tend to do is just to go upwards on the hover until the highlight actually highlights the area that I want, which is this div right here. Let's go ahead and copy this div and put it into our code just below our navbar. Now, once I've done that, you can see we've got our centered screenshot, text, button, and an image. Let's first fix that image so we can see what things should look like. And their source is from the Bootstrap docs, but instead we want to use the one of the moving van so that we can show our users what our services are all about. And now all we have to do is just to replace the text. If you look inside the starting file folder, there is a file called website text. And here you can simply copy all of the website text and replace the relevant parts. The H1 should say move with joy. And then we've got a long bit of text, which we're going to replace with our paragraph. So let's just copy everything in that paragraph element and replace it. And then our buttons should say get a quote and contact us. And now we have a hero section done in 2 seconds. Okay, maybe it was a little bit longer, but you can probably see just how powerful this is. So now let's keep going. In the next section of our example website, we've got some features, and this is where you would usually tell people what's so special about your particular startup. Well, our startup is really professional. We are available countrywide and we have a personal touch. And you might have guessed this comes from the Bootstrap examples page. They have a section called features, and this first feature is perfect for our needs. And I think a lot of Bootstrap design kind of comes from Apple, because when you look at the Apple website, a lot of the buttons, the shading, the kind of fonts, they all look really, really similar to the Bootstrap components. And I think this is probably one of their design inspirations. And we can get that simply with some copy and pasting and a little bit of customization. Again, let's go into the section of the features that we want, and then we're going to keep hovering up until we find the div that contains all the things that we want. Right click, copy element, and we're going to put it below the previous section. Now let's take a look at our good work. We have our columns with icons, and we've got 3 features. Let's change the text of all of this first. And I'm going to fast forward through this section so you don't have to watch me copy paste. And there you have it. We've now got all the text replaced, and we should have all of our copy, which is the text for your website, inserted into the relevant parts. Now, one thing that you'll notice is very obvious is that this part does not look like this part, and it also doesn't look like the part that we copied the code from. So what is going on here? Well, as I mentioned, most of the Bootstrap styling and components come from Bootstrap classes. For example, this one looks like this because it has a class of icon link, but sometimes we might want to customize the styling that we get so that we have some of our own design features on top of what Bootstrap already addresses. If we right click on these styled squares from the example website, And if you scroll up to find the div where it highlights the entire square, you can see that this div actually has some custom styling. Now, the reason why we know it's custom is because all of the default Bootstrap classes come from something like utilities.scss. For example, the background gradient, for example, the margins, the align, etc. But the parts that come from custom CSS for this page is going to have a file that looks like this. So for this features page, they've created some custom CSS, and in that custom CSS file, they've got little bits of CSS just to make things look a little bit more custom rather than coming from Bootstrap. So the part that we're missing, as you can see, is something called feature icon. So if we copy all of this CSS and put it into our CSS here between the style tags, then when we look at our website, we can see those squares styled the way we want. Now, what we're going to have to do is to remove the SVG in the examples and replace it with our own SVGs that we've downloaded. So let's go ahead and find the first one, which is here. Let's go ahead and delete this and simply add an image with the source set as the first one, which is the briefcase, because we're saying how professional we are. So let's change the alt text. And the second SVG we'll replace with the image that is the bus front. And this is because we're saying that our services are available countrywide. And then for the final feature icon, we're going to change it to the chat square heart to say how much of a personal touch our company has. And now we should have all of the icons set up, but they're a little bit small. So in order to get it to the right size, we'll do the same thing that we did with the icon up there. We'll give it a different height. So let's go ahead and add a height of 30 to each of these SVGs. And now they are all correctly sized. And while you've been doing the copy and pasting, you might notice there's another SVG here, which is the chevron right, which is this little forward button here. We can also replace that with our images, which is the chevron right, and we'll give it an alt text and copy and paste this to all three places where they exist. Now, the reason why the SVGs that we copied from the features section doesn't work on our website is because SVGs can be installed in many different ways. We can download it, just as I have done, and put them into the project folder, and you can access it through the SVG element or through an image element. Alternatively, you can simply copy the entire HTML code. For a clean look, I've simply downloaded each of the SVGs into our resources folder and added them as images. It really is up to you how you want to do it. Now that you've seen a little bit about how we can use the different code snippets from the Bootstrap components or from Bootstrap examples, I've got an exercise for you. We know that the next section after features is our carousel, and it's simply a component that allows you to scroll through different pages. Now, the one that I've chosen here has an indicator at the bottom, so you can easily switch to whichever page you want. It's got the side buttons here, so you can go left and right, and all it has are just 3 large images. But be aware that the images don't go all the way to the edge. Instead, they are aligned with the rest of the content. So have a think about what you've learned before. Have a read of the carousel documentation. Find the example that you think looks the most like the outcome and see if you can complete this challenge. Pause the video now. All right, if you completed this challenge successfully, we've now got another section here, which is a Bootstrap carousel, which is really neat when you want to display some gallery images, or maybe you have some testimonials you want users to be able to flip through, or maybe you want to show all the members of your team. And if you look inside the carousel example here, you can see there's an example with different text, but the example that I use is actually even simpler than that. It's in the docs inside the components. So going back to the components now, we can take a look at how the carousel works if you want to have a read. But I've chosen one of the basic examples, which has an indicator where you can toggle to different pages, and we simply have a big image covering the entire carousel. Let's copy this code and paste it into our website. Now, when you paste it, you won't see anything happen at all, and the reason is because there's no images. The images are broken. And that's because the images have no source set by default. So let's go ahead and set our carousel image source. So the first one we're going to set to the couple, and the second one we're going to set as the dog. This is almost like an evolution of a family, going from a couple to a dog to a family. And finally, we have all of our photos set up. And now if we take a look, you can see our carousel is showing and it's working. But it's maybe a little bit too big. It's kind of taking up more than the height of the website. And that's because this is set to cover the entire width. If you remember from previous lessons, one of the best components to size everything evenly is from the layout section, and it is our container. We know that we're going to get a uniform look if we put things inside a container div. So that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to create a div and I'm going to set it to class of container. And I'm going to move the final closing div just below the carousel. And now when we go back, you can see our carousel is nicely enclosed inside the container. And you can see that no matter which size I change to, we've always got a consistent look with that container responsiveness. We're now ready for the final section of our website, which is just the footer. And I haven't done a lot of work on the footer. I've simply gone into the snippets, found the footer section, picked one that I liked, and then hit inspect to find the starting point of the footer and pasted that code into the correct position. I'm not going to modify this too much because you already know how you can do that, but just look at how easy it was to create this beautiful website in a matter of minutes using Bootstrap components. The components are really, really handy, as are the snippets and the example code, because they allow you to pick a style out of their palette that you like and simply add it into your website. And this makes it super easy to build well thought out designs very, very quickly. In addition to the layout classes that Bootstrap gives you, the component classes, there are also utility classes and helpers. And one really important aspect of this is spacing. Very often when we're designing websites, we'll want to add margin, we'll want to add padding, and this is all spacing, right? As you might remember from previous lessons, padding sets up the part between the item and the containing div, so this part. And the margin sets up the spacing between the outline of your item and any other components. So you can set all of those values using very simple Bootstrap notation. So let's run through this quickly. It's a format where you have the property, which size you want, a dash, and then the size. And this is really easy to figure out. So for example, if I wanted to set margin only to the top of my element, then I can say MT, so M for classes that set margin, T that sets margin top or padding top, and then using a dash, I can say how much margin I want. So 0 is eliminating the margin, and then we can add a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. So if I had margin top 5, that's usually the maximum that you'll need. And then there's this concept of X and Y. So if you want to set the margin for both the top and the bottom, you'll use the X axis. And if you want to set the margin or padding for the left and the right, then you can use that y-axis. So maybe you'll have my-3. It looks like my 3, but it actually says set the margin for the y-axis to a size of 3. It's relatively easy once you understand it, but when you just see it in the code, it can be really, really confusing. But now you should be able to see that in our footer, we've got MB-2, and that of course stands for adding margin to the bottom, and it's a size of 2. That's how we can decode all this. Now, the final neat trick I want to show you in this lesson is how you can add dark mode to your website, flipping the colors around by simply adding one property into your HTML tag. If you go into the customize section, go into color modes, you'll see that Bootstrap now supports dark mode, and it can flip the entire project's theme to the opposite color simply by setting the data Bootstrap theme to dark. Let's try that out on our website. Let's go all the way up to our HTML. After the language is set, let's change the theme to dark, and you can see our entire website has now been reformatted to a dark theme, which is super neat if this is the design that you want, or if later on when we learn about JavaScript and we can put in buttons to change the theme of our website to whichever the user prefers, so that the user can change that theme to whichever they prefer. So now you're starting to see how powerful Bootstrap can be using these examples, using snippets, using the pre-built components and styling, as well as the layout system. But if you've tried to build websites before, you've probably come across full page themes completely built out for you. For example, with Squarespace. The catch though is you're going to have to pay something like £12 a month or $10 a month in order to just be able to use these templates of theirs and to have your website on the internet. What I want to show you is that with Bootstrap, there are a whole bunch of free themes and paid for themes that you can use that are one-off costs for you to build beautiful websites and simply customize the themes now that you know all about Bootstrap. One handy template is from W3 Schools, and they have some of the most common website layouts, like a blog. You might have a sidebar, main, a footer, or what a portfolio might look like, or what a web page might look like, a social website, etc., etc. And they've built these simple examples for you to be able to simply take the code and customize. In order for you to use their examples, you can simply do as we have done, find a template that you want to replicate and then customize it and maybe add some more custom CSS in order to achieve the look that you want. If you think that these are a little bit basic, because they are, the idea is they're mostly for layout, getting the big structure done using the Bootstrap layout system. There are a lot of other beautiful Bootstrap themes that are more complete in a way, starting with the official Bootstrap themes itself. If we head back to the main Bootstrap website, click on themes, you can see that they've got these professionally designed websites, and many of them look absolutely incredible. So depending on what it is that you're trying to build, you could use one of these templates. But the only downside to this is they are in fact all paid for, because there's a lot of work that's gone into it, right? But these are mostly one-off costs. And if you don't want to pay to get a theme, you can always search through Google for free Bootstrap templates, and you'll find a whole range of websites that have free and paid for Bootstrap websites. And again, you can do the same thing as we've been doing so far in this lesson, just getting hold of the components you want, customizing it, and getting the design that you're looking for. So hopefully in this lesson, you've seen that Bootstrap can be incredibly easy to create components and features in our websites very, very quickly. And it has consistent and beautiful design to boot. And if you've really taken to Bootstrap and web design, you can even create and sell your own themes. If you really enjoy working with Bootstrap and designing websites and creating websites using the Bootstrap components, you can create the templates yourself and put them onto marketplaces and sell them as a potential source of income. So have a play around with the other components, see what Bootstrap themes are out there, and in the next lesson, we've got the final project for this section where you're going to be building a fully fledged startup website all by yourself using your knowledge of Bootstrap. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. All right, so now that you've learned all about Bootstrap, it's time to apply what we've learned and build a project. I want you to imagine that a startup has approached you to build their landing page. So the company is called TinDog, and they make basically Tinder for dogs, helping dogs meet new and interesting dogs nearby. Obviously, this is a fake startup that I've created. Now, if you want to go ahead and steal this idea, then I fully support you. But essentially, the idea is very simple. You have a dog, you want your dog to have friends, so let's use TinDog. Now, our website is pretty fully fledged, and if you want to look at what the finished product looks like, head over to appbury.github.io/TinDog. And this is what you'll see. It's a really simple startup website with an animated gradient background, with buttons to download the app, as well as features, testimonials, pricing, and a footer. We're going to be creating this beautiful website, and the way we're going to do it is through the use of the different snippets that are provided by Bootstrap, as well as the different components, and using Bootstrap layout to get it responsive and looking beautiful on desktop and mobile straight out of the box. To get started, first download the TinDog project, unzip the file, and open it inside VS Code. Now here, I want you to open up the index.html, and you can see I've provided some comments and some section HTML elements. These section elements are mostly used to separate different sections of a website. So it's just a group or area of the website, and in modern websites, you'll see very often these sections. So this one is a section, this is a section, this is a section, and it keeps the code nice and organized. And you're going to be writing your code in between these section elements in order to create each of these areas. Now, what are you aiming for? Well, you can always refer to the live website appbury.github.io/TinDog to see what everything should look like. But I've also provided goal images for each individual section that's marked up to point you to certain areas that need more attention. For example, what's the name of the image that's going to be displayed here? Well, it's iPhone.png, and you can find it inside the images folder. But also things like this little apple icon is actually an SVG, and you can find those inside the README. So I've included all the SVG code in here, and I want you to be copy and pasting these SVGs because some of them have different heights, they have different sizes, and instead of getting it from the Bootstrap website, which this is from, I want you to use this version. So just copy and paste it into your code. Also, if you scroll down, there's the text copy that you'll need on your website. And so you can either copy it straight from the final finished website, or you can use the text from the README and just copy it from here. If you're working as a web developer, this is a very common workflow. You'll want your client to create the text copy because they know the most about what they want on their website. And all you have to do is just to place it and style it in the right ways. Now, the final thing I want to mention is if you look inside the style.css, this is going to be your CSS style sheet for the website. You can see that already in there, I've got a class called gradient background. And this code comes from a code pen by Manuel Pinto, where he created a pure CSS gradient background. And we're simply just using this code, but defining some unique colors of our own. And you can see in here, we are having our animated gradient hovers between these three colors, a blue, a red, and a sort of peachy color. And that's how we're going to get this gradient background. Similar to other things you've been doing with Bootstrap, in order to get this gradient to show, all you have to do is to add this class to your HTML element, and then it will automatically animate with this beautiful color scheme. This project is going to require a little bit of exploration, a little bit of looking around the Bootstrap examples, seeing which ones might work, and comparing them. For example, which of the heroes might be the one that we could use, or which of the features might match the one that we've got here, and customizing it and checking its CSS and making sure that things look pretty much the same as the final outcome. Now it's time for you to pause the video and give this challenge a good go. You might have to spend half an hour on it. Just give yourself lots of time to make mistakes, try things out. Don't be too harsh on yourself. This is a big project, but I believe in you. I think you can do it. Pause the video now and see how you get on. All right, hopefully you've completed this challenge and you're just here to see how I'm doing it. If you haven't given this a go, I really recommend you to stop, pause the video and actually try it first, because you can listen to me all day long, but you're not going to learn until you actually take the first step and write the code yourself. I know it can be really, really tempting, but I promise you, this is the only way you're going to be able to move on to harder things in the future, by struggling through each and every single step. Because once we start moving on, I'm going to assume that all of these things are in your tool belt. So make sure you practice, and this is a perfect opportunity. All right, pep talk over. Let's go ahead and build out this website. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is build out this title section. So if we take a look at the title goal, we can see it's pretty much what we call a hero section. If we take a look inside the Bootstrap examples and we look inside the heroes area, you can see it looks incredibly similar to the layout here. It's got some big text, some buttons, and an image to the right, which is pretty much what we have. So let's go ahead and right click, inspect, and scroll up to the top level that contains everything just after the divider, and let's copy the entire element. I'm going to paste that element into this section area, and let's hit save and see what it looks like. So I'm going to show preview just to get this URL, and I'm going to open it inside Chrome so I can see it in full screen. Now you can see this doesn't look like Bootstrap at all. The text is not the right font, the buttons are not styled, this is just pure HTML. This should give you a big hint as to what is wrong, and that is because we have not yet added a link to the Bootstrap CSS. So let's go ahead and do that now. So if we go back to the main Bootstrap docs and go to the home page, we should be able to grab hold of the link and we can paste it into our project. So now let's hit save and go back to our tin dog. We should see that we have what is closer to the example that we saw right here. There's a couple of things that we will need to fix. First, let's go ahead and get rid of this broken image and put in the image that we want. Here is the image. So let's go ahead and change the source to our image, which is inside the images folder, and it's called iphone.png. And let's change the alt to app demo. Let's hit save and go back, and we can see this is absolutely massive. So now we're going to have to adjust the size. So here it's set to width 700, height 500. I'm going to keep the aspect ratio, so I'm going to delete just the width and hopefully it will adjust proportionally. And I'm going to change the height to 200 pixels. And this looks more or less the right size. Now yours might be a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. It doesn't really matter as long as it looks good to your eye. Now the next thing we're going to do is let's change all of this text so that it reads the same as the final copy. And to do that, I'm going to find the text inside my README, go ahead and copy and paste it into the right areas. So we've got an H1, and that's where we're going to replace with our big heading. Meet new and interesting dogs nearby. And then I'm going to delete this paragraph element because we don't actually have it in our final design. And I'm going to change the two buttons to both say download. In addition to the download, there's obviously 2 SVGs as well, and these are the icons from Bootstrap. But remember, I mentioned that you can get hold of these SVGs in the README file. So I'm going to wholesale just copy this Apple SVG and paste it into here, add a space between the SVG and download, and now hopefully we have a good looking Apple symbol in the download button. And I'm going to do the same with the Google Play logo. Hit save, and that's it. There it is. We're going to change the color scheme here a little bit. We've got a button light and we've got a button outline light so that it would look the same as the final design. Now, right now, this button is a button primary, so we're going to have to change that to light. And this one, instead of button outline secondary, we're going to change that to button outline light. Let's hit save and see what we have. Now, you'll notice that this button's almost completely disappeared, if not for this rollover effect. And the reason is because it's more or less a white outline. In order for this to show, we need a background. So let's go ahead and set it up with this CSS gradient background. Remember, I mentioned that if you look inside the style.css file, there is already a class called gradient background, which we can add into our HTML for it to show up. Now, where do we add it? Before we can add it, we need to import our CSS. And as always, we put our custom CSS after the Bootstrap. So in case there are any collisions in terms of targeting the same selectors, the final one wins out, which hopefully is our CSS. So I'm going to link to the style.css, and then I'm going to put that class gradient background into my title section. So where do I put it? Now, if I put it inside the container, you'll see that it's only inside the container, and the container's got these big margins on the left and right. So this is not the look that we want. Instead, we're going to put this inside the section. We can't put it into the ID because it's not an ID, it's actually a class. So make sure you've got it set inside the class property. Now let's take a look, and this looks pretty good. Now, the only difference between what we have and what we're aiming for is a lot of padding. Now, the reason I can tell it's padding and not margin is because padding extends the background. So if this was an extra margin, then this area would be white, but instead it's actually the same as the background color. So where does this margin come from? Let's go ahead and hit inspect and make this just a little bit smaller so we can see this padding. And if we scroll up until we see the padding show up, you can see that orange down there when I hover over it. Well, that is what we need to get rid of. So you can see we've got padding top and padding bottom. And if we get rid of the top and bottom, it will look a little bit too much. So if we just target the bottom, then we've got more or less the right layout. So let's go in here and find that py5 for the container, which is right here. And remember, the P stands for padding, the Y stands for the Y axis. So it means it's adding padding to the top and the bottom. So if we want to change this to only have it on the top, then we change this to PT, padding top. And then we've got another div that has the padding on top and bottom as well. So let's change it there. And then when we go back, we should see that we have pretty much the same layout. And now if we compare our layout to the final outcome, it looks pretty much exactly the same. So we can now move on to our next section, which is the features section. If we open up our features goal, you can see that we've got 3 different areas with all of the features that we want to show off. And we've got this sort of rough layout. If we go back to the Bootstrap examples, and if we look inside the snippets at the features, you can see this is pretty much the same layout as what we're aiming for. So let's go ahead and inspect and find that row that we need to get hold of. Let's copy the element and put it inside our index.html. Now, once we paste it in, let's hit save and see it. You can see this is occupying pretty much the entire full width, which is not quite what we want. We actually want it all to be roughly along the same vertical line. So why is this? Well, it's because the top level here is a bootstrap row. If we want it to be contained, then we need to add a container. So let's add that container class, and then let's move this closing tag to wrap it around all of this. Hit save, and now you can see we've got that perfect alignment. The next thing we need to do is we need to get rid of all of these buttons, and that is pretty easy. They're just these anchor tags. So there's one there, there's one here, and there's one up here. So now we're pretty much on the design we're looking for. All we need to do is replace the text. This is probably a little bit boring, so I'm going to use video editing to speed things up a bit for you. All right, so now that we've got all of our custom copy in, the final thing we need to fix are these SVGs. So let's go ahead and replace the SVGs that are in the example with the ones that we want. So the first one is going to be the checkmark SVG. Let's copy and paste it in. The second one is the graduation hat. And the final one is the heart with an arrow through it. So now that we've replaced all of our SVGs, you can see them show up, but the background doesn't look quite the same. It should have these rounded corners, it should be a little bit larger, and when we look on the Bootstrap example where we copied our code from, they look perfect. But why is it that when it's in our website, it doesn't quite look the same? Now, this might be something that you got stuck on, but in order to figure this out, the easiest way is to inspect on it in Chrome. You can see right now I'm highlighting the SVG, but if I go one level above and hover on that div, that is the one with all of that fancy styling. And if we look inside the styles, you can see there's actually some custom CSS in here because it's not in the utilities, which comes from Bootstrap. This is actually custom CSS just for this feature section. So what we need to do is we need to copy all of the CSS and put it inside our style.css. So now this icon square, which is the class for this div, can be activated, and when we look at it now, you can see that they all have the right styling that we expected. So the final thing we need to sort out is just to add a little bit more margin in this features section, and then we're pretty much done. So if we look at the features goal, you can see I've given you a hint that it's actually margin top 5. If we want to add some margin to this entire container, then we can go up to the div class where we have the container, and then we add margin top 5, empty-5. And now we should have enough space between that top title section and our feature section. So we're now ready to move on to the testimonial section. Again, let's take a look at the goal that we're looking for. So the first section is an H2 with an image and some paragraph text. This area comes from this Jumbotron section. And if we scroll down, we can see this full width Jumbotron right here. So let's go ahead and inspect on it. And let's take the entire section just after the divider. So let's copy the element and paste it into our testimonial section. Let's take a look at what that looks like. It looks pretty good, but we need to modify it for our purposes. So let's change the text inside. If we go over to our README, we should see our quote here from Pebbles, and we can replace the text inside the H1. Remember from our HTML classes, we should only have one H1 per website. And remember at the beginning in our title section, we've already got our big heading. So here it should really not be an H1. Let's turn it into a subheading by changing that to an H2. Now, this paragraph element, I could delete it, but I'm actually going to keep it and use it for showing the name where the quote comes from, which is Pebbles from New York. And all I have to do now is add an image in between. And the image is going to be our dog image, and I'm going to add the alt text as well. Let's take a look at what that looks like. It looks great, other than the fact that this should be rounded and it should be a little bit smaller. If we look at the goal, we can see it should be 100 pixels high and it should be circular. So how do we make it custom? Well, we're going to need to create some styling, right? So let's create a class called profile-image, and let's set it to have a height of 100 pixels. And in order to make it circular, remember we need to set the border radius to 50%. Now, if we apply that class to our image, profile-image, and we look at our website, then you can see that looks pretty much perfect and similar to what we've got here. Now, the only thing we need to add is just a little bit more margin. We should have a margin of 5 between these two sections and a margin of 2 between these two sections. So I'm just going to add some margin top to the image. So a size 5 margin to the image. So I can hit space on the class and then do margin top dash 5. And then for the text, I'm going to do a class of margin top dash 2. And now we should have enough space in between everything, and it looks pretty much the same as the example. Now we need to add in all of these outlets that have featured our startup. And you can see from the goal image here that we've got a 12 column grid here from Bootstrap, and they're each occupying a fourth of the space. But notice here where I've said it should take up 3 columns on desktop, but a full width 12 columns on mobile. So it should be responsive. And we can find all these images in the images folder. Let's go ahead and add that below this container. In order to create the Bootstrap 12 column layout system, the first thing we always need is a container. So let's create a div of class container. And inside here is where we need our div that has a class of row. So now we're ready to create our columns. Each of the columns are going to be 3 columns in the desktop format. So that's col-large or LG, and it's going to be -3. But on mobile, so col-SM small is going to be full width, so 12. And inside here, we can place our image, which is from the images folder. And we're going to start off with TechCrunch, and I'm going to add the alt text as that. Now I'm going to copy this and paste it 3 times. And now I'm just going to replace each of these images with the ones that we have here. So Mashable, Business Insider, and TNW. All right, so now we should have all of our images, but they are a little bit large. One thing we can do is we can limit their height so that they are all equal in height instead of having this uneven start and end line. So I'm going to set the height to 30, and that should be enough height to be visible, but not so much height that it takes up too much space. And that looks pretty good. So now we're done with our testimonial section, and we are on our penultimate section, which is the pricing plan. And as you'll remember, Bootstrap has the pricing plan section right here. And these 3 cards are the ones that we want to get hold of. So let's inspect on that and find the area that we need, which is probably this div row. So let's copy it and put it inside the pricing section. But as you remember, a div row needs to go inside a container. So let's go ahead and do that. And if we look at our pricing table, then it's already in and looks pretty good. The other section we need is a title for the pricing table, which is this area right here. And this is the div that contains all of that content. So let's just copy it and put it at the beginning of our container right here. So now we've pretty much got the pricing table down. We just need to update all of the text here to the ones that we have in our copy. So I'm going to do this again quickly. I'm going to fast forward and replace all the text. All right, so now all the text has been replaced and you should see all of that text inside the pricing section. So now we need to update the design a little bit, and the main difference is the color scheme here is all using the Bootstrap primary color, which is this blue, but we need to change it all to the dark kind of color, which is this kind of black color. And if you look inside the pricing goal, you can see the parts that we need to change. This needs to become outline dark, this needs to be button dark, and this also needs to be dark. A shortcut here is to simply use the Control F on Windows or Command F on Mac in order to bring up our search bar. And if we search for the word primary, and we replace it with dark, then we can actually go through each of these examples and see if we want to replace it. What I recommend doing is to actually do this one by one instead of doing replace all, because that way you can see which parts you're replacing. And many times I've done replace all only to find out that I've messed up the entire project in some big way. So just a word of advice, go through it one by one, make sure that it makes sense and it's the right area that you're changing. But hopefully when we go back to our website, we can see we've now updated all of the right places to this dark color scheme. Coming back to our pricing goal, we can see that this title needs to be an H2 and this subtitle needs to be a paragraph element. So let's go into our section and make sure that is the case, because when we copied it over, it actually gave us an H1. Now the styling's not going to change because it actually comes from the display 4 class. So you won't see the size change that much or the color scheme, because it is actually not dependent on the HTML element. And this happens very frequently with Bootstrap. So we're able to adjust that pretty easily. And now we're ready for our final section, which is the footer. So let's find ourselves the footer snippets, and let's find the one that looks like one that we want, or one that is similar to the one in the example, which is this one right here. And let's find the container that we can copy and put into our footer section. So now straight up, we can see our footer section show up, and all we need to do is to adapt it to our design. Firstly, you'll notice there's this area that you can't really see, but when you hover it, it seems to be clickable. And if we refer to our code, you can see this is actually a link that links to the Bootstrap logo. So let's go ahead and delete that. But let's change this paragraph class to copyright and then the name of our company, Tin Dog. And I'm going to leave these links alone because, I don't know, maybe in the future you'll want to use this website and put in some different links to different sections. But for now, it just kind of looks more or less the right kind of style that we would want on a startup website. So let's leave that alone, but let's get rid of this border line here. And this border came from the footer, so there should be a hint in here. If we look at the footer element, you can see there's the border top class, which again comes from Bootstrap, but it's a really simple way of adding some borders to the top left or right. But once we delete it, then that's completely gone. So the final thing we need to do is just to add that gradient background to the footer area, and then we are pretty much done. So let's take that section footer and add the class gradient background. And now hit save, and we should see that we have almost the same website as the final result. The only thing that we need to do now is to get rid of this little bit of space at the bottom. And the fact that it's white should give you a hint as to what it is. If we select our footer section and we go into the section, look inside the container, at some point our hover is going to show us where that margin comes from. And right here you can see that orange box showing that margin at the bottom. So if we select it, we should see there are some margin classes applied. So there's a margin top, which I think we should probably keep because it adds a good amount of spacing between the different sections. But the margin bottom we could probably get rid of so that we don't have that white space down there. So let's find this my-5 class in our footer element. It's right here, and let's change it instead of y to just having it on top. And now let's hit save and refresh, and you can see we have now completed our design for our website. In less than half an hour, we've managed to build an incredibly complex and beautiful website for our Tin Dog startup. I hope our clients will be pleased because we've created this amazing, incredibly modern looking website for them. And we should be pleased because it only took us so little time to do by leveraging the power of the Bootstrap components and using the different helper classes, utilities, as well as snippets that they provide. Hopefully this gives you an insight into how we can use Bootstrap to create beautiful, complex websites quickly. And also you see the difference between what CSS Grid, Flexbox, and Bootstrap are all good for. They all have different strengths and weaknesses, and I think Bootstrap is really good for throwing some components down and creating something that looks incredibly modern very, very quickly, whereas Flexbox and Grid are great when you want to get into the nitty-gritty of creating a very, very custom layout for your website. So well done on completing this section, and in the next section we've got the capstone project for CSS. So once you're ready, head over to the next section.